The late afternoon heat settled over Oak Hollow like a heavy quilt. Dust floated lazily in the air as folks gathered around the worn-out auction yard, boots scuffing against dry gravel, voices low and familiar. The Templeton Auction Grounds hadn't changed much in 40 years, and neither had the people. Jebediah Crowder stood near the edge of the platform, arms folded across his chest, hat tilted low over his weathered face. At 63, he'd seen just about everything that could happen at a livestock auction. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to emerge from the old stone well at the center of the yard. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint splash, like a fish jumping. Then a low, broken whinny echoed from beneath the ground. Conversations stopped. Silas Boone Weatherford, the local vet, glanced up from his clipboard. "Did you hear that?" he muttered. Jeb didn't answer. His boots were already moving, kicking up dust as he made his way toward the well. Forgotten, sealed, ignored for decades. Or so they thought. People crowded around as a soaked, trembling horse's head slowly rose from the black water below. The animal gasped for breath, eyes wild, muscles quivering. For a long second, no one moved. Then Sheriff Amos Clyde Rollins pushed through the crowd, eyes wide. "What in God's name?" he breathed. Hank Jarrett, Jeb's former ranch hand, didn't wait for instructions. He grabbed a rope from the back of his truck and tossed one end toward the struggling animal. "Hold on, boy, just hold on," Silas muttered, already on his knees at the edge, helping Hank loop the rope. Zeke Holloman had his phone out, filming every second, mouth hanging open in disbelief. The crowd worked together, pulling with all they had, boots slipping, hands burning. When the horse finally emerged from the darkness, collapsed on the dirt, soaking wet and barely breathing, the yard went silent. Patsy Lou Crenshaw whispered a prayer under her breath, while Ida Mae Calhoun clutched her chest. Dixie Ray Hargis, the local reporter, dropped her notebook, stunned. But Jeb couldn't breathe. His eyes locked on the horse's neck, where a crescent-shaped scar still marked the skin. He knew that scar. He'd buried that scar. "Prairie," he whispered, barely audible. Across the yard, Laverne Sue Templeton stood frozen on her porch, glass trembling in her hand. The horse that had disappeared 10 years ago, the one everyone believed dead, had just climbed out of a sealed well. Jebediah Crowder didn't move for nearly a full minute. The name had slipped from his mouth like a ghost. Prairie. No one said a word. The crowd had backed away just enough to give the horse some air, but their eyes remained locked on Jeb, searching for meaning in his silence. Prairie lay on the ground, soaked, ribs visible, breathing shallow and labored. Yet even in his weakened state, there was recognition in the way his eyes followed Jeb. The old man felt a knot rising in his throat, his pulse pounding in his ears like distant thunder. Silas Boone Weatherford gently ran his hands along the horse's side, checking for injuries. "He's malnourished, dehydrated, been through hell," he murmured. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Something was off. "This horse has been down there a while, but he ain't just fallen in. Someone put him there." The words settled heavy in the air, and a few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Amos Clyde Rollins adjusted his belt and shot Jeb a sideways glance. "That well's been sealed for 20 years, Jeb. You sure this is the same horse?" Jeb didn't answer. "Not yet." His fingers trembled as he knelt down beside Prairie. He gently brushed the mud from the horse's neck, revealing the old scar more clearly, a crescent moon, like a cruel smile carved into the skin. "I branded that horse myself when he was a colt. He was 6 years old when he vanished." His voice cracked, and he looked up, eyes scanning the familiar faces around him. "I buried him, or thought I did." Laverne Sue Templeton, watching from the porch, whispered something to herself that no one could hear. Zeke Holloman, still holding his phone, lowered it slowly. "Sir, if this horse was dead, how the hell is he standing here now?" Jeb didn't have an answer, But the question hit harder than expected. Dixie Ray Hargis stepped forward, notebook in hand, her voice unusually soft. "Do you think someone switched the body? Lied about the burial?" Jeb shook his head slowly. "I don't know anymore." His world, once built on certainties, was shifting under his feet. Amos crossed his arms and looked over at Hank Jarrett, who had stayed unusually quiet. Hank's face was pale, and he avoided Jeb's gaze. "You worked the ranch back then, didn't you, Hank?" the sheriff asked, his voice low. Hank nodded, slow. "Yeah, I did." His eyes flicked toward Prairie, then back down to the ground. And in that moment, Jeb knew. The truth wasn't buried with Prairie. It had been walking around Oak Hollow all these years. The next morning, Oak Hollow was buzzing. Word of the horse in the well had spread like wildfire. Folks from neighboring towns rolled in with coffee in hand and questions on their tongues. Dixie Ray Hargis's early article had already gone viral online, complete with a photo of Prairie lying in the dirt, eyes half-lidded, and Jebediah "Jeb" Crowder crouched beside him like a man who'd seen a ghost. But for Jeb, there was nothing to explain. Not yet. His thoughts were trapped in a loop, replaying every moment from 10 years ago when Prairie disappeared and everything in his life began to unravel. Inside the barn at Templeton Auction Grounds, Silas Boone Weatherford was tending to Prairie. The horse had made it through the night, but just barely. Silas moved slowly, careful not to spook him, wiping mud from Prairie's coat and administering fluids. "You're tougher than hell, ain't ya?" he whispered. Prairie flicked an ear but didn't lift his head. Silas glanced over his shoulder when he heard boots behind him. It was Jeb. He looked like he hadn't slept a minute. "He's holding on," Silas said softly. "But he needs peace, rest, and answers." Jeb nodded, jaw clenched. "He was stolen. I always suspected, but I didn't have proof. Then the fire happened, and I thought he was gone for good." His voice cracked. Silas didn't push. Jeb was a man who didn't spill easily. But the pain in his voice was unmistakable. "Who'd want to hide a horse in a well?" Silas asked. "That ain't just neglect, Jeb. That's cruelty." It was personal. Out in the yard, Amos Clyde Rollins leaned against his patrol truck, sipping stale coffee. He watched as Hank Jarrett walked past him, head down, shoulders stiff. "You're avoiding him," Amos said. Hank froze. "Avoiding who?" "Don't play dumb," the sheriff replied. "You know something. You've always known more than you let on." Hank stared straight ahead, jaw tight. "I was just a ranch hand, Amos. I did what I was told." "Told by who?" Amos pressed. Hank didn't answer. Across the yard, Patsy Lou Crenshaw and Ida Mae Calhoun stood near the fence line, whispering behind gloved hands. "You remember when Jeb's wife left town?" Patsy asked. "About a month after Prairie disappeared." Ida nodded slowly. "Some folks said she couldn't handle the loss. Others said it was guilt." Patsy narrowed her eyes. "Or maybe it was both." Back inside the barn, Jeb placed a trembling hand on Prairie's neck. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Someone had lied. Someone close. And that someone was still walking free in Oak Hollow. Later that afternoon, a quiet unease settled over the Templeton Auction Grounds. The usual noise and laughter of Oak Hollow seemed to have drained from the place. The barn, once filled with life, felt heavy with silence. Prairie lay on a bed of clean straw, his breathing shallow but steady. Silas Boone Weatherford sat nearby, watching the horse with the same attention he'd give to a dying friend. Every so often, he glanced toward the barn door, expecting someone, or something, to break the stillness. But it wasn't footsteps he heard first. It was voices. Whispering. Behind the barn, out of sight, Hank Jarrett was speaking in low tones with Zeke Hollowman. Zeke had tracked Hank down earlier, saying he had questions. But what started as curiosity had turned into something more dangerous. "I saw you that night," Zeke said quietly. 10 years ago. I was just a kid, but I remember. You were loading something into the stock trailer at Jeb's ranch, late. Real late." Hank's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you saw." "I know it was raining," Zeke replied. "And I know that same trailer was burned a week later." Inside the barn, Jebediah Crowder stood near the far wall, listening. He hadn't meant to overhear, but the voices drifted through the open slats in the wood. Zeke's words hit like a hammer. A burned trailer. A rainy night. A gut-deep feeling he'd buried for years came roaring back. Jeb gripped the edge of the stall, his knuckles white. The night Prairie disappeared, there had been no sign of a struggle. No tracks, no broken fence. But the trailer had vanished too, and everyone assumed it had been stolen. Now he wasn't so sure. Out front, Amos Clyde Rollins leaned against his cruiser, watching the barn with suspicion. He could feel it in his bones. Something was about to snap. He'd known Hank for years, but the man had always been too quick to fall in line when someone else pulled the strings. Amos had questions, and this time, he wouldn't let them slide. "Time to knock on some old doors," he muttered, climbing into the truck and turning the key. At her porch, Laverne Sue Templeton sat with a cold glass of sweet tea, staring toward the auction grounds. She hadn't stepped inside that barn in years. Too many memories. Too many ghosts. But now, with Prairie back, she could feel the past scratching at her door. She reached into her apron and pulled out a faded photograph. Jeb, smiling, with Prairie standing proud beside him. She turned it over. There, in her own handwriting, was a date. The same night everything went wrong. Back in the barn, Jeb turned slowly toward Prairie. His voice was rough. "Who did this to you, boy?" But deep down, he was beginning to realize. He already knew. That evening, storm clouds rolled over Oak Hollow, casting a gray hush over the town. Thunder cracked in the distance as Jebediah Crowder stood alone by the old paddock behind his property. The wooden rails were splintered now, half-rotten from years of neglect. But in his mind, they were just as they were the last time he saw Prairie run. Strong, new, full of promise. The memories came uninvited. Rain, smoke, the sharp scent of burning hay. A night when everything he knew unraveled. Inside the barn, Silas Boone Weatherford prepared another round of antibiotics for Prairie. The horse was still weak but stable. Silas ran a hand along Prairie's neck and froze. There was something beneath the skin, scar tissue, not just from the Crescent brand. Another mark. Deeper. Hidden. "You were tied up," he whispered. "Pinned down for months, maybe longer." His stomach turned. This wasn't just abandonment. This was deliberate cruelty. Torture. Meanwhile, Zeke Hollowman sat in the back of the feed shed, scrolling through old files on his phone. He had synced footage from his family's security camera archives. His father had once run a feed supply business behind Jeb's old ranch. One grainy clip caught his attention. A man in a soaked flannel shirt, loading something heavy into a stock trailer on the night Prairie vanished. Zeke's fingers trembled. The timestamp matched the date on Laverne Sue Templeton's photograph. He enlarged the frame. The face wasn't clear, but the outline of the man's hat was unmistakable. Sheriff Amos Clyde Rollins pulled up to Laverne Sue Templeton's house just after sunset. She met him at the porch, already waiting, holding a yellowed envelope. "You might want to see this," she said, handing it to him without a word. Inside were receipts, feed bills, vet records, all in someone else's name, but for a horse that matched Prairie's description. "He didn't die in that fire," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He was moved. Hidden." Amos stared at her. "By who?" Laverne's eyes filled with tears. By someone we both trusted. Back at the ranch, Jeb heard a car pull into the driveway. He turned slowly to see Hank Jarrett stepping out, his face pale, eyes full of something between regret and fear. "I need to talk," Hank said, his voice shaking. Jeb didn't answer, but stepped aside. Hank walked past him into the barn. The smell of hay and silence wrapped around them like fog. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Hank began. "But once it did, I couldn't stop it." And in that moment, Jeb realized Hank wasn't hiding the truth anymore. He was finally about to confess it. The rain finally came, soft at first, tapping gently on the tin roof of the barn. Inside, the light flickered as Jebediah Crowder stood across from Hank Jarrett. The barn smelled of wet wood, dust, and something older, guilt. Prairie lay silent in his stall, breathing slow, eyes barely open. Jeb didn't speak. He just waited. And Hank, for the first time in a decade, stopped running. "It wasn't just a fire," Hank said quietly. "That night, someone lit it on purpose. But it wasn't meant to kill Prairie. It was meant to cover something up." He paused, throat tight. "We were ordered to get rid of him. Bury him. Make sure he'd never be found." Jeb's face didn't move, but his eyes were locked on Hank's. "Who gave that order?" he asked, his voice sharp. Hank swallowed hard. "Your wife, Jeb. Lorraine." The name fell into the air like a stone dropped in still water. Jeb stepped back, disbelief and fury colliding in his chest. "That's a lie," he muttered. Hank shook his head. "She said the horse had seen something. Or someone. I didn't understand it back then, but she was scared. Said if you ever found out what was really going on, it'd ruin everything." Jeb clenched his fists. "So instead, you helped her lie to me. You burned down my barn and told me Prairie was dead." Outside, the wind picked up, sending leaves spinning across the yard. In the sheriff's office downtown, Amos Clyde Rollins studied the receipts from Laverne Sue Templeton and the photo from Zeke's footage. Piece by piece, it was all coming together. Feed bills, veterinary visits, false names, all connected to a horse that wasn't supposed to exist. He grabbed his keys, knowing he couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone in Oak Hollow had lied for years, and someone else had paid the price. Back in the barn, Hank took a shaky breath. "I didn't bury Prairie. I couldn't do it. I took him to the far edge of the ranch, near the old well. Figured nobody ever went out there. I locked the gate, left him food and water. Thought it'd be temporary. But then Lorraine disappeared, and I didn't know what to do." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Jeb. I was a coward." Jeb turned away, struggling to breathe. His wife's departure had broken him. 4 years, he'd believed she'd left because of grief. Now he knew it was something much darker. Something hidden behind gentle smiles and soft words. And as the rain poured harder, Jeb looked back at Prairie, still alive despite everything. The truth was out, but the damage had already been done. Jebediah Crowder didn't sleep that night. The barn lights stayed on, casting a soft glow over Prairie's stall as thunder rolled in the distance. Jeb sat in an old wooden chair just outside the stall, staring at nothing. The truth was out now, at least part of it, but it felt like opening an old wound, only to find it had never healed. Lorraine. Her name echoed in his mind like a ghost. He had loved her deeply, blindly, and now he had to question everything. At sunrise, Jeb made a quiet decision. He returned to the old ranch house he hadn't entered in over 5 years. It stood like a monument to memory, dust-covered and silent. The screen door creaked the same way it always had. Inside, the air was still. Photos of happier times lined the walls, Jeb and Lorraine, smiling, Prairie in the background, full of life. As he moved through the rooms, something drew him to the study, the place Lorraine used to write letters, recipes, and journals. He hadn't touched her desk since she left. A loose floorboard under the desk caught his eye. He knelt down, pried it up, and found a small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in old ribbon, was a letter addressed to him. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. He unfolded it with trembling hands. "Jeb, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you the truth face to face. I'm sorry. I was scared. Not of you, but of what I became. Prairie saw me that night, Jeb. He saw me meeting someone I shouldn't have been meeting. Someone who threatened to expose everything unless I gave them a reason to stay quiet. I thought if I removed the witness, it would go away. I never wanted to hurt that horse. I loved him too, but I let fear take over. I asked Hank to help, and he did. You trusted both of us, and we broke it. Lorraine." Jeb sat on the floor, letter in his lap, heart pounding. The pain was unbearable, but the clarity cut through years of fog. She hadn't just run. She had buried herself in shame, and taken everyone else down with her. Hank had helped, but it was Lorraine who lit the match, both literally and metaphorically. Later that morning, Jeb returned to the barn and placed the letter in Sheriff Amos Clyde Rawlins' hand. Amos read it slowly, his face darkening as he pieced everything together. "Well," he said quietly, "looks like Oak Hollow's been living under a lie for a long, long time." And just like that, the past wasn't just haunting Oak Hollow anymore, it was demanding justice. The rain had stopped, but the weight of everything that had come to light still hung thick in the air. Sheriff Amos Clyde Rawlins sat behind his desk, Lorraine's letter unfolded before him, the ink smudged from his fingertips. He had read it 3 times, and still, it didn't sit right. "Fear makes people do stupid things," he muttered to himself. But this was calculated. He looked up as the door creaked open. Patsy Lou Crenshaw stepped inside, her face tight with concern. "I heard about the letter," she said. "And I know it ain't my place, but I think Oak Hollow deserves to know the truth." "The whole truth?" Amos nodded slowly. "They will. But I'm not sure they're ready." Patsy stepped forward, voice firm. "Then make 'em ready. Prairie was more than just a horse to this town. He was part of our lives. If he survived that well, the least we can do is tell his story." Meanwhile, Jebediah "Jeb" Crowder was saddling an old mare in the back barn. Not for work, but for something heavier. Prairie, though recovering, couldn't be moved yet, but Jeb needed to ride. He needed the silence of the hills, the weight of the reins, the wind in his ears to think. As he rode out toward the far ridge of the ranch, the land opened up like a wound. Familiar, but changed. He passed the overgrown trail that led to the well, now roped off and silent. At the top of the ridge, he stopped. The view overlooked all of Oak Hollow, the auction grounds, the feed stores, the crooked fence line of his old property. He dismounted and pulled the letter from his coat pocket again, holding it against the wind. "You were scared," he whispered. "But you didn't have to do this." He closed his eyes and let the letter fall. It danced in the wind before landing gently in the tall grass. Back at the barn, Silas Boone Weatherford stood beside Prairie, gently brushing his coat. The old horse was alert now, his eyes tracking Silas's every move. "You're stronger than all of us, you know that?" he murmured. "You carried this town's secret longer than any of us could have." Zeke Hollowman arrived with his camera, but this time he didn't film. He just watched, quiet, respectful. As dusk settled, Amos stood on the courthouse steps, Lorraine's letter in hand. Dixie Ray Hargis was setting up her recorder, the townsfolk gathering behind her. Ida Mae Calhoun stood beside Laverne Sue Templeton, hands clasped tight. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about reckoning. And Oak Hollow was finally ready to face it. The courthouse steps had never seen such a crowd. Word had spread fast, faster than wildfire, that Sheriff Amos Clyde Rollins would be reading the letter aloud. Not everyone believed it. Not everyone wanted to. But they came anyway, boots heavy on the pavement, hats in hands, silence humming like electricity in the air. Jebediah, Jeb, Crowder stood near the back, arms crossed, eyes locked on the folded letter in Amos's hand. His face showed nothing. But inside, a storm raged. Amos cleared his throat and looked over the crowd. He wasn't the kind of man who liked speeches. He kept his thoughts to himself, preferred action to words. But today, words mattered. What I'm about to read, he said, voice low but firm, isn't just about one horse. It's about truth, trust, and how far people go to hide from both. He unfolded Lorraine's letter. As he began to read, you could hear the sound of a boot scuffing against concrete, the distant creak of a weather vane turning in the wind. Otherwise, nothing. Oak Hollow held its breath. By the time Amos finished the last line, some folks had tears in their eyes. Others looked away, ashamed or stunned. Laverne Sue Templeton wiped her glasses, while Patsy Lou Crenshaw muttered, "I always knew there was more to it." Ida Mae Calhoun, stoic as ever, placed a comforting hand on Jeb's arm. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared ahead like he'd been carved from stone. Zeke Hollowman, standing near the edge of the crowd, turned his phone off. For once, he didn't need to capture what was happening. He could feel it, the weight of decades collapsing in a single moment. Behind him, Dixie Ray Hargis took notes with shaking hands. "Truth is a funny thing," she said softly. "It doesn't just change what happened, it changes how we live with it." Back at the barn, Silas Boone Weatherford sat beside Prairie, the old horse now standing, though still weak. Silas kept his hand gently on his neck, whispering words only the two of them could understand. "They finally know, boy. They know what was done to you." Prairie blinked slowly, shifting his weight. It wasn't healing, not yet. But it was the beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, Amos folded the letter again and stepped down from the platform. He met Jeb's eyes and nodded once, silent understanding between old friends. The damage was done, but there was still a path forward. And tomorrow, Oak Hollow would wake up a different town. 1 week later, the sun rose differently over Oak Hollow. It was still the same quiet town, still lined with weathered fences and aging barns, but something in the air had shifted. Truth, once buried deeper than the old well, now moved freely through the streets. People greeted each other with fewer guarded smiles, more knowing eyes. Some hearts remained heavy, but they were open now. And for Jebediah "Jeb" Crowder, that alone was a miracle. At the Templeton Auction Grounds, the well had been sealed for good, but not erased. A small plaque had been placed beside it, reading simply, "For the ones who endured in silence." Prairie stood nearby in the pasture, head high, coat clean, his frame still thin but gaining strength by the day. Children who once feared getting too close now fed him carrots through the fence. Silas Boone Weatherford watched them from the barn, smiling faintly. "Good boy," he whispered. "Still got people to heal." Jeb stood at the gate, one hand resting on the top rail, eyes fixed on the horse he once thought lost forever. Patsy Lou Crenshaw joined him, folding her arms. "Funny thing about pain," she said. "We think hiding it will protect us. But it just makes it last longer." Jeb nodded. "And truth don't make it disappear. But at least now I can breathe." Patsy touched his arm gently. "You deserve to." Later that afternoon, Sheriff Amos Clyde Rollins and Hank Jarrett met in the empty church parking lot. The law had to take its course. There were charges to consider, statements to give. But Amos looked Hank in the eye and said, You didn't save Prairie for yourself. You did it for Jeb. That counts for something." Hank nodded, eyes glassy. "I'll carry it either way." He turned and walked away, not free, but finally honest. At the edge of town, Laverne Sue Templeton sat in her rocking chair, Prairie's old saddle beside her, freshly polished. She stared out at the hills, a soft breeze brushing through the wind chimes. "Maybe now we can all rest a little easier," she whispered. Ida Mae Calhoun joined her on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Rest," she said, "and remember." That evening, Jeb walked into Prairie's stall alone. He placed his hand on the horse's neck, eyes full but dry. "You came back," he said softly. "And so did I." For the first time in years, he felt whole, not because the pain was gone, but because he'd faced it. And in Oak Hollow, under a golden sky, what had once been buried now stood in the open, alive.